There is a glaring error in the philosophy of Austrian economics. It's hard to find, but if you go over the argument slowly, it becomes clear as day. Once you get it, you will be able to participate in a much more practical discussion of solutions for economic issues. I'm Dylan Moore, co-host of Amagi, the place where anyone can turn for improvement in every aspect of themselves, whether that is professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. In this episode, we will be separating the good from the bad in Austrian economics, both in its core philosophy and how economists use it as a practical model. How we approach economics with the scientific method may surprise you. Stay tuned. You can find more of my work at my YouTube channel, The Volitional Science Network. You can also find the work of our other co-host, Nima at economicsjunkie.com. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. This is episode number 23, hashtag WTF Austrians.
And we are going to be talking about an interaction I had with Tom Woods on Twitter. So he was tweeting something about how the great...
Tom Woods of the Tom Woods Show, by the way. Big libertarian show. I'm assuming if you're listening to this, you probably know what it is, but I just wanted to throw that out there in case you didn't know who Tom Woods was.
Yeah, he's an economist. And he also... What was that?
I was going to say he's kind of I don't know, does he consider himself a philosopher? He's a big libertarian figure.
Yeah. And he also has his own online course, I think, on economics. So he was tweeting something about how the Great Depression was not caused by fiscal policy, because fiscal policy was unproblematic, I guess, in his view, but it was caused by monetary policy, you see, because the Federal Reserve apparently lowered interest rates too much.
Can you go over really quickly what the difference between fiscal and monetary policy are?
Yeah, so fiscal policy means changing the size of the government deficit, and monetary policy means changing the interest rates and other methods of injecting money into the economy via the central bank, I guess. So, I mean, that's how he's looking at it. As far as monetary policy, I personally would say monetary policy is changing the risk-free interest rate. You know, that's
right, which we've gone over extensively in previous episodes.
That's because of all the realizations that we've had. It's actually become really simple to understand monetary policy these days. It's just really changing the Fed funds rate, which is the risk-free interest rate, which has is tied to lots of other interest rates. And whether or not the Federal Reserve buys bonds and does something like QE or whatever is, in our view, rather irrelevant. And, you know, empiricism, I would say, has also proven us right on that. But I was telling him in response that the fiscal policy was precisely the cause of the depression. Budget surpluses have caused a depression or a severe recession 7 out of 7 times. And in
U.S. history.
In U.S. history, yeah. So we've also gone through that, and so I just linked to the historical evidence on that. And then Tom Woods' response was not debating with an MMTer. So,
and this is very funny. For anyone who listened to my debate about MMT on the Tom Woods Show.
Right.
I reached out to Tom Woods, and he actually invited me onto his show. I don't remember how long ago this was. Was it a year ago? 6 months ago? I don't remember.
Yeah, something like a year ago or something.
To debate Bob Murphy, who's an obviously Austrian economist. And Tom Woods acted as the moderator, and I felt that he did a great job, and he was very polite. And at the time, he was even... You could tell in his moderation, he was making it obvious that he wasn't trying to take Bob's side, that he was trying to be as objective as possible, and actually kind of like throwing me some small bones in terms of the debate in order to, you know, show his objectiveness, because obviously he's biased towards Bob, which I thought he did a great job, and I'm kind of shocked He's gonna come.
In his own mind, he was just seething. He was just sitting there and holding it all back. I imagine now.
I guess, I don't know.
So,
and then what was the next response?
Well,
because it's kept going, right?
Oh, right. I don't even know. Oh yeah, I have it down here. So then I just retweeted his statement, not debating an tier, and I said, Austrian economist Tom Wood's response to empirical data proving austerity-induced lack of net private saving causes severe recessions or depressions every single time. So I just shared his tweet saying, not debating with an M tier. And then he responded to that saying, so that means we should never ever have another recession. I hope your crazy theory that makes no sense is right. To which I responded, not sure why you're putting words in my mouth. In a net import economy, net private saving can go negative if the current account deficit expands enough or the budget moves towards balance or a combination of the two anytime.
Which is stuff we've, again, covered extensively in previous episodes if this is the first time you're hearing that sort of language.
Right, and he didn't have much more to contribute thereafter, so obviously.
So I think we could unpack a lot from this interaction. And I think the most important one is what you said, is the question of empirical evidence. So when I considered myself a follower of Austrian economics, one of the reasons I followed it was because it comes off as something that is very philosophically sound. And in fact, tell me if I'm wrong, Nima, you're the economics junkie, not me. The starting point of Austrian economics actually is philosophy, where the whole idea is to say, okay, what are the different effects of wealth generated through or gained through violence versus wealth gained through trade, and then they take everything as a derivative of that. Would you agree with that statement?
I guess I would require going back to the beginnings. I mean, the Austrian school, I think, started with Menger, or maybe, Mises probably made it much more popular. And Mises wrote a lot about just the philosophy of economics, of what is economics. And so, Austrians have always been pretty philosophical, I think. So there's certainly an overlap.
Okay, because one of the things I super appreciative of the Austrians.
Rothbard literally wrote books purely on ethics, but then also books on history and books on economics.
Got it. Well, because one of the things I always wanted to say that I always noticed about Austrian economics is this hyper focus on ethics, which I really, really liked, and because I saw that they made this very big effort to have a philosophic grounding with their economics, I guess I just assumed that territory came with empiricism.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the problems with Austrian economics is they're very they pride themselves as being very logical. And they certainly make a huge effort in being logical, but they don't really, they're skeptical about empirical evidence, to use the words of Bob Murphy. And so they can go, they start with an axiom, which is, in their view, irrefutable, because that's what axiom is. Axiomatic. And so then if all your following theories are based on that axiom and it's all syllogistic reasoning, then your ensuing theory must be right. So, and maybe they have a point, I guess, because if you do start with something that's irrefutably true and you only have logical syllogisms from there, then yeah, of course, your theory is probably going to be correct. However, what if you just say that you're basing your ideas on irrefutable axioms, but you don't actually do it. Like, for example, Austrians take the whole neoclassical story of barter for granted. You know, it's like a white spot. Is that a white spot where something you don't know and you don't even, whatever, I don't know.
Blind spot.
Yeah.
It's a second language, give him a break. Third language.
Well, I think there's actually this whatever, doesn't matter. But so blind spots, where they don't really consider that, maybe we challenge that assumption, because as we've done many times here, we've talked a lot about the empirical basis for the assumption that everything started with barter, and it doesn't look very good for that theory.
Well, and on top of the fact that there's this assumption made that everything started with barter, there's also, tell me if I'm remembering the name of it correctly, the money regression theorem? Or is it the barter regression theorem or the money regression theorem?
The regression theorem in short.
Okay. So the fact that an economist would have the gall to use the word theorem to talk about something with economics is something a physicist won't even do. Right? There's the theory of gravity. Yeah. There's the theory of quantum mechanics. Yeah. There's a theory of the Big Bang, because even though there's a lot of evidence supporting these things, or a lot of evidence to say, okay, this is why we have this sort of this explanation that we have. It's still a theory because it can always be challenged. The realm that we see the proper use of the term theorem is in pure mathematics, where what we've done is we've set up an axiom that's true by definition, and then we move from there, which is why it's the only area that we could actually use the term theorem, because it's like it's must be true because that's the way we defined it.
Yeah.
So the fact that word is even being used in an area outside of mathematics, in this case economics, should be a little bit of a red flag for someone who understands the difference between the words theory and theorem. And if you have been listening to our Evolution of Civilizations series, I believe I brought this up in one of the first episodes, was Carol Quigley, who we're reading from this book, The Evolution of Civilizations, pointed out that the Pythagorean cults of ancient Greece, which is where Plato learned a lot of his stuff from, emphasized the perfection of the rational mind and de-emphasized the evidence of the five senses, because the five senses couldn't be trusted. The truth could only be arrived at through the workings of the rational mind. And when we move on to Plato, and Plato comes up with this bizarre idea of this world of forms, where there's this perfect world that we all saw before we were born, and that we're like deeply familiar with, maybe subconscious. The concept of a subconscious didn't exist back then for him to talk about. But like the idea of a chair, there's a perfect form of chair, or there's this perfect form of planet, or there's this perfect form of government, which is where, he got the idea of the republic, and he was working with that. And what it does, this whole conception, this is what it means, I guess, to call someone Platonic in the philosophic sense. I know they use it in a dating sense to mean non-romantic, but in the philosophic sense, Platonic means to put your rational mind before evidence. And Carol Quigley even argued that this thinking is what killed any scientific revolution. The possibility of any scientific revolution in ancient Greece, because the requirements of science, which is to say we must look at the evidence, we must use the sensory data, and we always have to assume our rational minds may be missing something, and they must constantly and to infinity be tested and retested, which is what we saw in after Galileo in medieval Europe. particularly once we got to Isaac Newton, which led to the scientific revolution, it's because they took the opposite of the Pythagorean idea. And what we're looking at here, when the Austrian economists reject empirical evidence, and like you said, in the last conversation between Bob Murphy and Stefan Molyneux, Bob Murphy said it very clearly that Austrian economists are typically skeptical of empirical evidence and have a tendency to argue things a priori. Now, a priori, if I might be wrong on the history of this, is a word that's more associated with like the Romantic German philosophers, and particularly Immanuel Kant. And a priori means the same thing that I just described with the Pythagorean cult or with the Platonic philosophy, is to argue from the pure rational mind, the pure reason, while identifying the evidence that we pick up from the senses is something that cannot be trusted.
Well, I mean, the Austrians, their explanation is a little more complex than that. You know, that the senses don't
give
trust.
It to me.
They just, at least from the ones I've read, I think Mises mostly, he makes the case that the economic system is so complex and human interactions are so complex and outcomes are variable, you know, and the lack of the existence of constants. Like, for example, in physics, you have certain constants like the speed of light and this and that. In mathematics, you have the rational number or the irrational number.
Irrational, like pi or e or whatever.
Right. And he says in economics, there are no such fixed relationships, so it's impossible to make scientific predictions, but also the entire economic system is just so complex, and causation and correlation can never really be established. And for that reason, there's no value in empirical evidence to understand economics.
Carroll Quigley had the perfect answer to that too, and he aimed this. He was particularly aiming it at history in this book, The Evolution of Civilizations. But he very clearly stated that this applies to any social science, which I guess we can include economics under the umbrella of. Is how could somebody possibly say that and still continue to be an economist?
Yeah.
Same thing with, because historians make a very similar argument, which is to say, okay, there's all this stuff in history, and there's no way to, because there's an infinite number of facts, there's no way to draw any patterns out of it. Well, if that's the case, why are you continuing to be a historian? And Quigley even pointed this out, which was very interesting, because Quigley was he originally went to university for a biochemistry major. And then, I don't know, at some point, junior year or something, he switched to history. So his original grounding was very, very, very scientific. And he saw and commented on this as he found it very strange that the natural scientists would, even if a law, in quotes, like the theory of gravity or whatever, where we got a formula where we could write out a relationship, even if it was only accurate in 1 in 100 times, the physicists and the natural scientists had no problem writing it down, calling it a law, and using it in their calculations forever and anon. However, when he moved over to the social sciences, he found the opposite to be true, where even if a situation, a description or a formula worked 99 times out of 100, this wasn't good enough for the social scientists. And they said, okay, well, there's no way to understand anything because this isn't accurate 100% of the time. And his conclusion was, yes, social sciences are more difficult because they now involve the variable of human choice. However, more difficult doesn't mean impossible. So we cannot throw out the scientific method and empirical evidence just because it got a little bit harder. What that means is we have to focus on it even more.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, for me, being originally attracted to Austrian why can't I say that word today? Originally being attracted to Austrian economics because of the philosophic grounding that I saw in ethics, I was actually really shocked when I saw this, I guess, disdain for empirical evidence.
Yeah, and to the people who are in the Austrian community, etc., and when I would consider myself sort of Austrian, I thought the explanations were perfectly reasonable as to why we should not focus on empirical evidence too much. I thought, it sounded perfectly reasonable to me, but that's just how it works. That's how dogma works, I guess, on you. It convinces you of the most ridiculous things sometimes. And I don't want to say Austrian economics is a dogma. I'm just saying in general, that aspect of it I found to be dogmatic. And so I changed my mind on it.
Well, and then that doesn't mean we have to throw out the ethics either.
Right.
Right? Because I think it's a very, very important, accurate, I had a third adjective, I can't remember what it was. Important and accurate distinction to notice that there is a philosophic difference between resources that are acquired through violence or coercion and resources that are acquired through trade and negotiation. That is like fundamental to understanding anything about philosophy. And I don't want to reject that, and I don't want to throw that away. However, what we have to do is say, look, when me and Nima are sitting here talking about MMT, when we see the description of actually, how do I want to say this? When we see that the situation of the economy does not match the description of Austrian economics, and we see that it does match the description of MMT, which we've spent several episodes going over, and so far I have yet to meet somebody who challenges me on MMT that doesn't bring up a point that isn't a straw man argument. Have you?
No, can't say. I mean, I haven't even gotten straw man arguments. So.
Oh yeah, you just get ad hominems.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So, just because the way that the system works is different from the way that the Austrians thought doesn't mean we have to throw the ethics out the window. It just means we have to apply the ethics appropriately to the new evidence that has come.
Right. And the practice of how it works is just, in our opinion, and the Austrian school has created this story of barter, and not just the Austrian school. I mean, that's the thing. That's why I sometimes say Austrian economics is almost like an offshoot of neoclassics, because the neoclassical school came up with that notion. And it starts with the barter theory, and then it goes from there to trade and barter and investment, etc. But that's not how it has ever happened in the real world, and it's not how it's happening in the real world. So the equivalent would be saying, could we have a historical school that amuses about what went on in Middle Earth versus a school that deals with, okay, what's going on Earth? If that makes sense.
I was just thinking about a comment on Tolkien. I think it's an excellent criticism of fantasy genre. I'm sorry, I'm changing the subject here a little bit. I'm a big Tolkien fan. That fantasy authors never take economics into account when they're writing their books. It's like they're just completely ignorant of it. And I think the good science fiction authors, which is kind of your closest cousin to fantasy, are the ones that do have some sort of understanding and relationship to economics, because then the stories gain more depth and they're more believable.
Yeah.
sorry, total offside rant. The only time that Tolkien brings up money in the Lord of the Rings, I think, is at near the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring when they're in the inn at Bree. They mentioned we need some money to pay for the inn or something, and that's the last you ever hear about money the whole time.
Yeah.
Goddamn fantasy authors. Anyway, sorry.
Well, maybe they're just predicting the cashless society already.
Or maybe it's fantasy, like you said. We're trying to figure out what the hell's going on in Middle Earth when the fantasy authors are going, we don't do economics. Quit trying to apply it to us. One of the things, so I'm, as anybody listening to us should know, both Nima and I have our own channels. Nima's got a website and I got a YouTube channel. And Nima makes videos too and posts them too. But do you have a YouTube channel or you're just on BitChute?
BitChute, yeah. BitChute.
Okay, Nima's mainly on BitChute.
I'm actually mostly on podcast, SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple, iTunes, whatever. You can get the Economics Junkie podcast. Yeah.
There it is. So I had someone challenge me on an older video that Nima and I did on MMT. And essentially, it was, as usual, the conversation always goes back to inflation and the nature of money. And he argued that, of course, due to massive money printing, particularly since 1971, when Nixon removed the partial backed dollar, that is what has greatly reduced the purchasing power of the currency. And I asked him, what's the empirical evidence that massive money printing in the United States caused the purchasing power of the dollar to drop? Now, I'm not saying that is or what isn't happened. I'm just asking the question because I'm thinking about empirical evidence now, and that people disagreeing with me might not have any. And he wrote back, he said, by virtue of the fact that it takes more dollars to buy the same thing today than it did 5, 10, 25 years ago. He said, do you think inflation magically imposes itself apart from the size of the country's issued currency? Now, if you're quick and you notice what he did here, is he only allowed me 2 options to explain myself. Do you think inflation magically imposes itself apart from the size of a country's issued currency? So he's saying the only way you're allowed to explain yourself is to agree with me that it is the amount of currency or to claim magic. This is super manipulative. And it's like there's this hiccup that the only way to explain loss of purchasing power is money supply, and that's it. And if you try to suggest anything else, they're just like, what is this, magic money theory? Are you just talking about magic? Yeah. It's a strange hiccup.
Yeah, we've talked about the prices and inflation on several shows, but technically sort of the focus on inflation is almost a bit of an obsession in some communities, and in the mainstream actually also kind of. But technically, I mean, if you're a free market economist, then you should understand that prices can go in many different directions, and we shouldn't really dictate what prices should be, or try to steer them. And mainstream economics tries to reduce inflation by raising the interest rates, which is complete nonsense in our opinion. Actually, raising interest rates are likely to cause more inflation because they inject more money than through higher interest rates. But also, in my opinion, actually, the reason why the Federal Reserve adjusts interest rates to inflation is to preserve the moneyed classes' interest incomes and their purchasing power. Because for people who have a lot of money in interest-bearing money in bank accounts or in mutual funds, money market funds. If inflation goes up and the Fed supports those holdings by upping the risk-free rate, which makes the savings rate go up as well, then their wealth is preserved. And so I almost tend to think maybe that's the reason why they do it all over the world, the central bank, just in the interest of the people with money. Yeah.
I never thought about that. That's probably, I don't have any evidence that that's true, but I have a hunch.
Now also, what we have with the 70s, after the US left the gold standard, we also happened to have a huge oil embargo, which made oil prices go over $100 for I think, the first time ever. And that led to huge inflation in the US. And there's nothing that raising interest rates can do about that. There's going to be an inflation regardless, and wherever your interest rates are, it won't matter. Actually, raising interest rates to 18% has, as Warren Mosler has argued, has probably caused more inflation. Because now you have a bunch of guaranteed income, universal basic income for the rich, essentially.
At 18%, which is huge.
Which is just the interest they're earning.
I wanted to say something else, if you don't mind me interrupting, about this point in time, 1971, when Nixon removed from the partial gold standard, and that supposedly prices skyrocketed because of this. And compare this to the claim that empirical evidence we need to be skeptical of. So when we, first of all, to look at this from a scientific viewpoint, if we see that the prices have gone up dramatically since 1971, and then we also see that there was this really big event that happened that Richard Nixon removed us from the partial gold back standard, ignoring the fact that it was only for international and that the national one was done in the 30s. We'll ignore that for a second. And you say, okay, this event happened and then this event followed. The Nixon removed the standard and then the purchasing power went down. That is not evidence. That is an observation that's enough to create a hypothesis to go out and find evidence for. Right? Yeah. And if someone says, I am skeptical of empirical evidence, then why are you pointing to causes in the past that may have created the effects in the present? Because I should be able to turn around and back to you and say, well, I'm skeptical of empirical evidence, so I don't care about that.
No, but if the evidence supports if the supposed evidence supports the theory, then it's okay, I guess.
Right. Well, and obviously, emotionally, that's what's going on. But I want to break that down because honestly, it's hard to think logically and it's hard to think scientifically. I'm not saying I'm doing it all the time, but this is the correct way in order to say, okay, this happened and then this followed. Now, that alone is not enough to say anything concretely. However, it is an observation worthy of making a hypothesis to further investigate. That's the way something like that should be handled. And as you brought up, if we do a little bit more investigation, there was something else that happened just at the same time, an oil embargo. Right? There was something happening with interest rates. And there was all sorts of things happening. And then the question now becomes, okay, we have all these variables, just like you said at the beginning, that we've got all these variables. How do we isolate? And instead of taking the Austrian excuse and saying, okay, there's too many, I can't do it, we say, okay, it's harder, but let's take a closer look. And as Warren Mosler pointed this out, as soon as the embargo was over, the inflation stopped.
Well, no, it was when the U.S. deregulated natural gas. Because
that was it.
Yeah, you had a competitive product.
Now, even that's not proof, but it is some evidence to support the theory.
Yeah.
Which is more than the pointing at the original fact that Nixon went off the gold standard. That's just the original observation.
Also, inflation by itself isn't really that relevant if wages went up or if incomes went up accordingly. So inflation by itself is just a complicated measure to look at.
Well, in addition to that, this is something he said, that the currency, or that when Nixon did this with the gold backing, it greatly reduced the purchasing power of the currency. Now, even purchasing power of currency is something really, really difficult to measure, because you can say, okay, a loaf of bread cost X in the 70s and now it costs 5 times X. Well, let's flip that in the other direction and say, okay, how much did an iPhone cost back in the 70s? Well, you couldn't buy an iPhone back in the 70s. Okay, so the money today could buy me stuff that it couldn't buy in the 70s. So did the purchasing power increase? Did it decrease? I don't know. It's a complicated question, like you said.
But plus your income went up, so, and interest rates usually compensate for expected inflation. So inflation by itself, this is probably a heresy from the standpoint of Austrian economics. But Warren Mosler, for example, he said there's not even really much evidence that inflation is bad. Sort of regular levels of inflation. But he even said, maybe he's going too far, I don't know. He even said 10%, 20%, that's not even evidence that is necessarily bad. Because if everyone's expecting everything's predictable, then people will just adapt accordingly.
Okay, well, let me flip the other side, which I think an Austrian would respond to, is that the damage of inflation is the fact that it erodes savings.
Well, that it doesn't, because savings accounts will just pay higher interest rates because the central bank raises the interest rates during inflation.
Yep. I just wanted to play devil's advocate.
But what Austrians actually say is that it's a redistribution of income, because those who receive the money first benefit from the increased money before those who get wages, etc.
Right, because money supply is the only thing that affects inflation, according to the Austrian view.
Whereas MMTers say that, at least the ones I've read, say that inflation is caused by investment spending plus export surplus plus the government budget deficit. If the combination of those things is high, then inflation is likely to be higher.
Due to money supply, right? Because there's other pressures on inflation as well, as you've again gone over extensively.
Sorry. So there's that kind of inflation, basically. So there's 2 different kinds of inflation. So the one is the one I just described, which I think they call demand pull inflation, which is investment spending plus export surpluses plus government budget deficit. And then there's also commodity price or monopoly price inflation, which is, for example, if you have a monopoly like OPEC, at least at the time, they could set prices. Then if they just up the prices, then that has an impact on all the other prices in the affected economies. Obviously sends more money to the oil states then also. But that is another possible cause of inflation from what I've read in Randy Ray's papers on that. But the former is the one that sort of is intrinsic, which is, I guess policy can somehow affect, because budget deficits are government policy, export surpluses, I don't know, and investment spending. Obviously, you could certainly do some policies to incentivize investment spending or drive it away. So,
right. I want to address your heresy too, where you brought up what Mosler said, that not that you necessarily agreed with it, but that inflation might not be that bad. And I remember him saying something particularly that, going back to what the Austrians were saying about money being a tool of savings, is Mosler asked the question is, we have to have the discussion of whether or not money is viewed as a tool of savings or if it's viewed as a tool of employment. and I never thought about this way until he brought this up, is he said, we have many different tools for savings. And actually, investment, too, right? But by savings, I mean, being able to save your money and utilize it later. We have many different tools for investments / savings, which is, buying treasury bonds or gold or buying rentals or mutual funds or whatever, right? There's all these things that you can put your money in to hedge yourself against the effects of inflation. However, what are our options for the tools of employment? It's money.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I know we could talk about, regulations, and the more regulations we have, the more difficult it becomes for the private sector to do anything to employ itself. But ultimately, that's secondary to the fact that the government demanded a tax to begin with. And the definition of employment is to work for the unit of account that the tax is demanded in.
Yeah.
So Moser's argument, and I think I agree with this, is that money needs to be seen as a tool of employment, not as a tool of savings or investment. Because we already have those tools.
Right. And technically, if you go back to the empirical creation story of money that we've talked about much and has been written about by David Graeber in Debt the First 5,000 Years, it is actually a tool for employment. The reason why the state needs money, needs to create money, is so they can move resources into the public sector, so they can hire people into the public sector. So they impose a tax, and so they spend money into existence.
Which we went over quite well in episode 1. Go check it out if you haven't already. Nima, we're bridging right up to the 45-minute mark here.
Right.
Got anything left, or you want to take it out?
Well, there was just a big discussion that also ensued around that, but I don't know if we wanted to point out any points, any particularly important points from that.
If you had a favorite one, let's do at least one.
Okay, my favorite one is MMT is garbage and will be garbage as long as scarcity exists. Okay?
Not an argument. I mean, there's your ad hominem for you.
Right.
Well, let's just pry into what he was probably getting at here. So, right. Again, this is the barter theory of money error, which is you're treating money as a scarce resource. That's where, because the Austrian argument is that prices tell us how resources need to be moved and where they need to go, right? As prices go up, that means move resources there. As prices goes down, we probably don't need the resources there so much. And they apply the same thing to money, and they say, okay, interest rate is the cost of money. And like you said before, if we increase the money supply, that decreases the purchasing power immediately.
Well, I don't think that's what he's getting at. I think what he's getting at is just that as long as scarcity of resources in the real sector, in the goods sector, exists, MMT makes no sense because MMT acts like there's an infinite amount of resources available.
Okay.
I think it's probably a straw man, and I don't think he's actually read it. And I think he's actually said that he hasn't read it. But I just thought I'd mention that one.
Throw that one out there. Again, another straw man of someone not understanding it, attacking MMT.
Seems like it, huh?
Yeah.
Well, there's also other people, it's good to see there's others who are sort of curious and interested and have informed themselves about the topic.
Yeah. And I mean, this is what happened to me when I first bumped into Nima's postings online, and I essentially accosted him, and I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about, boy? What is this shit? And I'm starting to get the same thing to happen to me now, and it's just so bizarre. I mean, it's simple once you get it, but it's so bizarre because it is so different from what we've been, I guess, programmed to believe. And so far, I'll say it again, I have yet to have somebody levy a proper argument against MMT that wasn't a straw man argument, where they didn't understand what MMT was saying, and so they attacked an argument that an MMTer is not making.
Yeah. Well, and I think
so. Yeah, I hope it induces curiosity.
It's kind of. I think MMT is very relevant and very important, even in the grand picture, in the grand scheme of things, because everything that we perceive as obstacles and threats to society and huge problems to surmount, they're just man-made problems. The countries are at war with each other because there are powerful people who make people in different countries hate one another. And there are powerful people who create stories about the scarcity of resources and the necessity of austerity and global warming hysteria and all sorts of mythologies that end up overpowering and ruling us because they've been so successful and so sophisticated. And MMT cracks open one aspect that where I personally hadn't really seen, that a lot of what I had heard was propaganda, even from people I thought were very awake. So I think it's just important to hack away at the matrix from all angles. And whenever you encounter falsehoods, and when you ever encounter giant mythologies that restrict us in our ability to move forward and to do things, then that's very important. That's very relevant. And with that, this has been Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Nima Majur of economicsjunkie.com, and Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube. And we are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time.